In my last video, I introduced for the first time the concepts of pleasure and righteousness as two key motivators in human behavior. Pleasure refers to physical and sensational satisfaction, while righteousness refers to mental and emotional satisfaction. Previously, I described these two forces in extremes, but now I'd like to present them in more general terms, as the terms are ultimately just heuristic labels that I'm using to refer to two very general kinds of forces at play in human experience, meaning they include things that are not explicitly implied by a narrow definition of the terms. One of the key differentiators between these two forces is that pleasure is distinctly overt and obvious, while righteousness is distinctly covert and obscure. For this reason, it is very easy for the feeling of sensory pleasure to overshadow and wash out the more subtle sense of righteousness. In the lesser extremes, pleasure simply reflects that which we can know, while righteousness reflects that which we cannot. And since our ability to know relies on our ability to remember what we know, pleasure stares into the past, into the determinate actualities that provide a foundation for our development of science and philosophy, and the basic sensation that we can gain a grasp of the world in which we exist. This is pleasure at work in its subtlety. The notion that we can limit and define experience is motivated by a desire to reduce the existential angst that comes with uncertainty. It would perhaps be more accurate to describe this not simply as pleasure, but as a recognition of the duality between pleasure and pain, and indeed all other dualities, which leads us to attempt to move away from what we perceive as the negative aspect of those dualities, like pain and uncertainty. What I am describing as pleasure is therefore simply all of that which makes us feel secure in an unsecure world. On the other hand, righteousness exists outside of the duality of good and bad, and thus has no need to chase intellectual and sensory satisfaction. It leads to a focus on the future, which is inherently unknown and potential. But without a sufficient grasp of the inherent value in righteousness, it appears to common people that to move towards righteousness is purely to move towards pain, and thus they are effectively repelled from it. Indeed, it is an often ignored fact that there is a genuine relationship between spirituality and symptoms of depression, and one of the reasons for this is that the righteous person has turned their back on sensory pleasure and the sensory world to some extent. For many people, this will genuinely be a painful experience. But for those who have sufficiently grasped the inherent value of righteousness, the identification with one's pleasure or pain becomes dissolved. And when this occurs, the much more subtle satisfaction of the mind begins to become visible. And this is indeed the feeling of righteousness I am attempting to explain. It is a joy of a different order, a joy beyond binaries, a joy felt not in one's body, but deep within one's heart, a connection to who we truly are, beneath our pleasures and pains. This joy cannot be intellectually formulated or defined through philosophy, yet it signals the only ultimate form of knowledge we can have. It is a direct understanding, a direct experience of the truth, which can never be found in the dualistic pursuit of understanding. Only by turning away from our desire to limit and define do we ever have a chance of truly knowing, and this is the reason why Western philosophy is filled with such disagreement and delusion. It's a tragic joke, really. I hope it's beginning to become a little clearer why righteousness, which is literally just a recognition that one actually understands something rather than just believing one understands, is a powerful counterforce to the more obvious feeling of pleasure. and we must recognize the difficulties here. For the individual who believes that they understand will believe they feel righteous. But this is not actually righteousness, because they do not actually understand. They believe because it feels good to believe we understand, but actually understanding does not feel good. When we are ignorant of the truth of righteousness, we are passively ignorant. We do not know that we are ignorant, and so we do not know that there is something there to experience. But when we are ignorant of the reality of pleasure, we are actively ignorant. We feel our ignorance as pain, and thus it is much easier and common for people to be attracted towards pleasure than to righteousness. Some people get lucky, and they discover righteousness on their own, but for the masses, it would require an entire institution and culture designed to help us acknowledge its existence from a young age. This is why the Western world is suffering from such a sickness. It does not help itself. In fact, it is founded on and encourages the very pursuit of pleasure that leads to its insanity, our emotional deficiency. Now, I know it sounds like I'm presenting righteousness as if it were somehow greater or better or more worthy than pleasure as a goal, but this is false. It is only greater in an emotional and idealistic sense, and it is lesser in an intellectual and realistic sense. The two are good for different things, and focusing solely on either leads to the very same state of experiential lopsidedness. While righteousness appears to us as reflective of the absolute truth of existence, it is an empty truth. It has no meaning without content, and that content is provided by lived experience, and all the dualities that go along with it. Something you're going to hear me saying over and over again throughout this series is that reality is grounded in the interdependence of two basic forces, which we could label as the ultimate and the immediate. In the context of our current discussion on human motivation, these manifest as righteousness and pleasure. There's a very subtle and nuanced point to recognize here. On the one hand, righteousness does indeed lead towards this ultimate truth, while pleasure leads to the immediate. But on the other hand, righteousness can never actually reach the ultimate truth, because the ultimate truth arises from the interdependence between itself and the immediate. It is, in a real sense, a self-referential paradox. The ultimate truth is that there is no ultimate truth, because the ultimate depends on the immediate, just as the immediate depends on the ultimate. But this is in itself an ultimate truth. It's a self-refuting idea, but it's also a valid one. It is therefore simply impossible to fully capture this ultimate truth, which is why righteousness can only be felt and never expressed. It is the end of an infinite sequence of recursion, much like the notion of the superjective, which you may have learnt about from my discussions on paraphilosophy. In the coming videos, we will explore how this recursion is the foundation for the power of creation, but I'll leave it at this right now, as I'm only going to be able to properly express the idea by casting it in various contexts. But the reason I have mentioned it here is because I do not want to give the impression that we should simply go chasing after righteousness and away from pleasure, because there is a significant caveat to this. We cannot have one without the other. By devoting ourselves to either alone, we become unbalanced, and this fact is the central flaw in both faith and reason. Faith puts too much emphasis on an ultimate reality. Reason puts too much emphasis on our immediate reality. In extremes, faith leads to optimism and essentialism and asceticism, where devotees abstain from sensory pleasure in the intent that one's self-mortification will enable them to achieve a higher kind of good. And conversely, reason leads to pessimism and nihilism and hedonism, where pleasure is viewed as the only reasonable target of a good life in the face of one's inevitable death. Both of these views rely on each other, and true peace only comes from relinquishing our addictions to either, which in turn allows us to embrace both as one.